Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Now finally I'm making videos again, and as I've previously stated, this video is gonna appear on Patreon 2 weeks before I'm gonna post it on my YouTube channel, again as a token of gratitude for those who are subscribed to me on Patreon. Alright, so in this video we'll talk about the division between real and imaginary things, or hyperreal things if you wish. Hence the title of the video. Actually I might come up with some other title, I'm not sure yet, but so far it's hyperreality, okay? I may not be able to give you a definition of hyperreality. There is a definition in postmodern philosophy, postmodernism, of what it is, but I'm not completely sure I mean the same thing under this term, but it's probably somewhere near anyways, alright? So I believe this concept is tightly connected to a general pattern of perception of human beings and maybe some other beings as well, we don't know, or we do know, I don't know, we'll see. So the general pattern I talk about is constructing objects from the sum of sensory experiences, alright? So it's the thing I've mentioned quite a lot. I've actually devoted a lot of time like ruminating upon in my video Mythology as Cultural Basis. I'll put the link in the description. So this process of constructing objects from the sum of our perceptions is so prominent and so well established to such a degree that even imaginary objects create perceptions in us in some way, right? As if they were constructed from the sum of perceptions, right? So in a way, this is the trick of hyperreality. It's that the imaginary thing acts as if it was constructed as a normal, real thing, right? So it provokes in us all these like sensory sensations, forgive me for this tautology, or like other cognitive processes of this sort, as if it was constructed in a normal way, like from bottom up. But here it's like working top down, if you wish. Alright, from the result to the whatever caused the result, rather than from causes to the result, right? So this is the difference between real and hyperreal. Real works from perceptions to constructing an object, and hyperreal works from a constructed object to the perceptions, right? Something like that. So it's this process is so prominent to the point that where imaginary things can in a way create real things, right? Cause real things to happen. And we will study this more like in different aspects. As I've said, I won't give you a real definition of what it is. In a way I just did, but it's not a real definition, if you know what I mean. It's just like a comparison of some properties thereof. So we'll examine at least 3 aspects. Maybe you can say we will examine some more stuff, but the 3 main aspects I wish to talk about are Gnoseological aspect, that is everything related to knowledge, like how this concept of hyperreality is related to knowledge. Then vulnerability of hyperreality itself, like how is it related to, I guess, infrastructure, and how it depends on it and how it is vulnerable because of it. And the moral aspect, like what do you do with it with regards to your own life, let's say. How do you integrate hyperreality into your own life? Something like that. And then we'll ruminate some more on some side stuff, okay? So let's start with the first one, the Gnoseological aspect, everything that is related to knowledge and things like that. So I've already discussed in one of my previous videos this concept of order versus chaos, where some pictures of the world say that the order comes from chaos, and some say that chaos comes from order, yeah. So, for example, religious thinking says that first there was order. Well, I mean, in the myth there was like chaos, but then there was order. But then this order produced the world, right? So by chaos, I mean the world we observe, which is kind of chaotic. But the from order comes chaos type of thinking states that there is an underlying order in things, right? It's just that this order is dressed up in this dirt of chaos that we observe, right? But we can uncover this hidden order behind things if we like push the dirt away, so to speak, right? Clean the world up, so to speak. Whereas order comes from chaos type of thinking states that basically the world is inherently chaotic. We just imply some order, or actually even more so, we insert order into it by our own will, by our own imagination and things like that, right? So we isolate things and sort of purify them to even recognize like separate things, if you wish to think in this way, like Platonic ideas, you know, or Kantian Dinge an sich, things on their own, right? Like isolated, pure things. So yeah, so my thinking is much closer to from chaos comes order, right? So I think that essence of things, like the ideas, only exist in our imagination, and by virtue of being so, or being such, they are hyperreal, right? So order is hyperreal in a way. It is constructed. So we can only hope to like throw the lasso of our thinking onto the neck of the bull of reality, so to speak. But the lasso of our thinking isn't equal to the bull's neck, you know. It can only like touch it in a way, right? And we only see our model of the world in a way, our ideal ordered model, but we don't really see the world itself. And that's actually what science is doing. It's actually observing the models of the world, right? It's working with models. Physicists sometimes even like directly call it toy models. Like they acknowledge that it's not even close to the real world, right? It's just some mathematical depiction of the world in a really simplified terms. And this is really what science is all about. It's working with with lasso rather than with the bull, you know. So a forecast of the model is not equal to the real trajectory of the world, which is infinitely more diverse and always has some like tongue-in-cheek way of subverting our expectations, I would say. So this is the Gnoseological aspect of hyperreality, that basically it has nothing to do with the world. Well, it has something to do with the world, but you can't infer the world from hyperreality, you know. It's rather, hyperreality is definitely inferred from the world, or at least inspired by the world, if you wish, but it's hyperreality that is born from out of the world, rather than the world is born out of hyperreal, you know. Hyperreal is created through real, but real cannot be recreated through hyperreal, if you know what I mean. It can be imitated by some hyperreal stuff, but they're not directly related. Like there's no 100% how do you say, equivalence, right? So this was the first aspect, Gnoseological. The second aspect is what I've talked about, what I've called vulnerability aspect, right? So, and it relates to the observation of how ephemeral idealistic worlds are. I remember this quote by Nietzsche that culture is only a thin apple peel over the glowing chaos. You know, so, well, in a way you can translate it into the context of this video and say that hyperreality is only a thin apple peel over glowing chaos, something like that. And it is exemplified like by the vulnerability of our virtual economy, which is by the way another example of hyperreality. I should have mentioned that like not only physical theories but scientific theories are also examples of hyperreality, right? But here economy is another example of hyperreality. Like economy doesn't exist, you know. It's like It's something ephemeral again. It's something idealistic, right? And especially like the more we build up our economy, the more virtual it becomes, the more obvious it becomes that it's hyperreal. Like right now we have like assets which are completely arbitrarily constructed and produced, such as cryptocurrencies, for example, right? And they're definitely hyperreal, and like it just makes obvious that the whole economy is built in this way in some sense, right? Fiat currencies is a hyperreal thing, etc., etc. And you can probably like follow this thread even lower and lower. Right, so the same goes for knowledge. Knowledge is hyperreal, or at least to a large degree. And anyway, whatever it is, what I'm trying to say in this segment, in this aspect, is that it all depends, all of these instances of hyperreality, they all depend on networks of infrastructure that support them. So hyperreality depends on these networks, supporting networks, rather than surpassing them, right? It cannot surpass them, but it depends on them. So hyperreality can disappear, and it wouldn't well, it actually would. Okay, like, never mind. I wouldn't make this statement. So yeah, so you know, like a fruit cannot exist without a branch and the leaf and the trunk and the roots and the soil and the rain and the sun. You know, just by the same token, hyperreal objects cannot exist without everything else that supports them. Like again, this video might be another example of hyperreal. Like you cannot, like, you think that what you see and hear is real, right? And well, to a degree it is, because, well, there's certainly like some physical and psychic, psychological aspects involved in it. Like you are receiving some information, or at least you think you are, right? But anyway, to make it all possible, what I'm talking about is for you to have a device on which you're watching this video, like it's either a mobile phone or a personal computer or whatever. You have to have source of power for this device, so it's going to be either your battery in your phone, or actually the connection to the power grid. You have to have, again, a power grid to charge your battery, or again, you use your computer. You have to have like a signal to whatever Google servers or clouds or whatever, wherever this video is stored for you to watch. And all of that should have been produced and should be maintained for you to watch this video, right? So you need, let's say, a factory that produces your device. You need workers at this factory. You need engineers that built this factory. You need a dude who invested in building this factory. You need something where he acquired the money to invest in this factory. You need like these workers to be fed and have shelter and food. Okay, I've already mentioned food. Well, safety, I don't know, whatever. So like you pull any of these threads and it turns into a huge network, right? You need like power lines to deliver the power to you from the power station. The power station, I mean the power plant, needs to have some fuel or whatever other means of producing the energy. Then there should be some other factory that produced all that. There should be people maintaining all of this. There should be like, well, you get the idea, right? So basically, more or less the whole economy of the world is involved in producing this video in a way, right? Which is hyperreal. And why is it hyperreal? Well, because it's not even me. Like, you think you see me speaking to you, and it's perfectly fine as a perception, but factually it's not correct, right? You're just seeing a bunch of pixels changing brightness on your screen. And what you hear is only like the oscillations of the membrane in your phone or your speakers or headphones, right? So this is what I call hyperreal, right? But the point I'm making in this segment, in this aspect of vulnerability, is that the disruption of this network in any significant node, like let's say your power went out, so you can't see me anymore, right? I've just disappeared. There's no longer me, right? So, and in the similar manner, any hyperreal object is vulnerable. Like if the supporting networks would go out or would be disrupted in any way, well, in any significant way, again, I should say, then yeah, goodbye, basically, right? So disruption leads to disappearance of hyperreal a lot of times in a lot of situations, and hence what I call vulnerability, right? Because it is. All right. So the third aspect is moral, so which I've described as what you should do with your life, even though I don't give like prescriptions usually. I probably did a couple of times, but again, I always say that it's your choice ultimately. So which hyperreality do you build? I wouldn't say would you or should you build. I would ask like lightly, do you build? Like speaking of this, you know, I've already mentioned this concept of information bubbles, so-called, or echo chambers is more or less the same thing. But echo chamber is probably more frequent nowadays, so frequently used. So what I mean by that is that there is a moral choice to be made. Namely, like, would you like to only keep the pleasing information to be able to come to you? Like, what I mean by that? Like, there are many hyperreal objects, and you can get rid of some of them, and it's pretty easy. That's what I'm saying. Like, again, like the modern, I don't know how you say it, infrastructure, again, unfortunately I have to use this word again, allows you to block certain hyperreal objects, all right? And yeah, so would you like to only keep the pleasing ones? That's the moral choice. Or would you allow any ones to approach you, so to speak? You know, and it's kind of this famous question of, would you rather be right or happy? You know, this is the dilemma, basically. Well, in a way, close to that. So with coming advances in virtual reality, and even if you look at Web 2.0, which we currently have, some people already talk about Web 3.0, but we're still in 2.0 phase as far as I'm aware, at least. So you can discard what you don't want, and the algorithms already do that. You know, you have YouTube recommendations, you have like Facebook recommendations. I don't even know if such a thing exists. It probably does. I mean, Facebook definitely does have some algorithms that, you know, filter your information. Actually, sometimes not in the way you want, but in the way they want, right? And probably even in most of the cases. That's other issue which we would return to later for a minute at least, about propaganda, right? But the question here is, would you do that? Would you filter your information? And here I want to transition already to these latter secondary parts of the video, which we're discuss various stuff related to that. So one thing that is related to morality is will to power, obviously. Namely, well, we just talked about things we like and things we don't like, right? Hyper objects that are pleasing to us and that are not. So things we like, we do like, and that's a general statement, because they give us the feeling of power, or at least we perceive that they do. So we feel more powerful because of them, and that's why we like them. Basically, that's what it means to like something. It means to receive the feeling of power from it, all right? According to Nietzsche, at least, and I completely agree with him. So you might say, okay, I'll just keep those things that give me this feeling of power. And that's a fair answer. I mean, why not? Yet, some people may decide to conquer, you know, establish their will over things which they don't like, right? To have even more power, because they say, okay, there's a domain of things that I already like, so they already give me power. This is my domain, so to speak. But let me like conquer this neighboring domain, which I don't have power over yet, but I will, right? Something like that. And in the video Bad Ending, where I talk about the bad endings in narratives, in stories and stuff, I've mentioned like instances of that, examples of that, namely masochism. Like the nature of masochism is exactly in that, in like sort of receiving the feeling of power through pain, if that makes sense. Like feeling pain and observing that it doesn't destroy you, and thus overcoming it, like feeling pleasure of like it's like, you know, meeting a final boss or something, you know. It kind of, you overcome it. It's very difficult and painful, but you overcome it and you feel much stronger afterwards. You feel a lot of pleasure, right? So you were strong enough to beat it, basically. So this is where masochism comes from, and sadomasochism and things like that. Then spices, which we, like seasonings for our food, have the same nature. Like the plain food we like, well, we like to eat, obviously, because it gives us the feeling of power. We grow, we become stronger, right? But plain food is too easy, you know, to eat. It's kind of easy to beat, you know. So we add something almost poisonous, like salt and pepper and various other things to it, to our food, to make it harder to beat. And then we receive more pleasure from it, right? So this is the fundamental nature of spices and seasonings, how they work from the point of view of will to power. Okay? Or you can look at how cats play. So when cats, like, they have a toy, right? So, like, they imagine it being, again, some mouse or whatever that they can eat, right? So, obviously, eating this thing would give them a feeling of power just in the same way as for humans, the food does, right? But cats play with their food, right? At least with the toys. I'm not sure cats play with, like, the actual dead, like, rats or whatever. I think they do to some degree, right? But they definitely do play with toys, but they don't try to eat them right away, because that would be lame. That would be too boring and easy, right? That's too easy. So they put it there and they start like playing with them, with these toys, right? Because it's much more fun to like chase a moving toy and try to eat it, rather than to eat just this lame and boring thing that just lies there, right? So that's absolutely the same nature, and it's also explained by will to power, obviously, just as I've shown. All right. So, which means basically that, returning to this moral issue, that people not locked in the bubbles, in the information bubbles, are stronger because they can handle like opposition in a way, right? They can handle being in an what's the word, unfavorable environment, let's say. Animus, no, like, what's the animosity? I don't know. Hostile, yeah, hostile environment. That's what I wanted to say. Okay, so let's talk about a related but slightly different thing. Christianity. Actually, any other religion, but Christianity is just a good example because, well, I'm from Christian culture, so not like a Christian family, but generally Christian culture. So I'm fairly familiar with it, so I can speak about it with more confidence. So with Christianity, and again, it probably applies to other religions, we invent almost like a perpendicular hierarchy of power where we are superior. We meaning Christians. And, well, I mean, okay, so, well, we kind of have to look at history, but I won't. I'm just like, I'm gonna give you an, there's a German word, Ersatz. I'm not sure what is, or at least there's a Russian word which comes from German word, which I assume sounds the same, but I don't know any English analogs. Like, again, a toy model, let's say, of history of Christianity, okay? So we invent a perpendicular hierarchy of power where we are stronger and better, you know, this give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, right? So Caesar's hierarchy is somewhere there, and we build God's hierarchy, which is perpendicular to Caesar's. Like, it's not related to it in any way, right? Hence this saying. So in one hyperreality, which is Caesar's hierarchy, we are losing, right? We are weak and poor, and at the very bottom, like, we are, I don't know, fishermen and poor people, homeless people, and whatever. So we're kind of losing. But in the perpendicular hierarchy, we can be almost saints. We can be almost at the very top if we just follow whatever Jesus asks us to do, right? So, yeah, we can rise up in this other hierarchy fairly quickly. And obviously it all comes down to the point of values, which I wouldn't really talk about, but you can see how it works, right? There is one hyperreality, but we invent another one which is more favorable to us, and we stick to it. And Caesar's people may actually stick to their hierarchy and just say, Christians, who are they? Like, they are nothing. And by the same token, Christians say, oh, who are these Roman people? They don't believe in God. They're nothing. Something like that. And so you can see from that how asceticism may arise easily. Like, there is a, well, in a way, natural hierarchy, natural hyperreality, where basically, like, well, raw power matters, right? Like, roughly speaking, money or something to that effect matters, right? Like, money gives you access to everything you want, or at least a lot of the things you may want, and hence it is good, right? So this is one hierarchy. So the more money you have, the higher you are in this hierarchy. But the asceticism says, no, let's invent, since we are at the very bottom of this hierarchy of money, let's invent another hyperreality where not having money is a virtue. And it like throws you to the top of the hierarchy. And not being able to experience like sensual pleasures or like, you know, whatever, like things that money can give you is a good thing, right? So hence, asceticism easily appears. Of course, there are other reasons for asceticism, like, I don't know, there may be like health issues or stuff like that, which some of which you may fix with the help of like, you know, how do you call it? Well, in general sense, sobriety, right? Something like that. In general sense of the word. Abstinence, I guess, is the more general word. All right. Hopefully you can see my point, right? That the different hyperrealities might coexist and different hierarchies may arise from them. Something like that. And it also gives you an example of how Christianity itself is a virtual reality, in a way overriding the real reality, which is actually only a hyperreality in itself. But the real reality, as we know, eventually adopted Christianity and turned it into almost like another hierarchy of a real sort, you know, the church hierarchy, which is almost like the Roman Empire in a miniature, you know, the church hierarchy. Which leads us naturally to the aspect of propaganda, finally, but it's going to be very brief. So, indeed, there is a propaganda aspect in hyperreality where constructed objects, okay, not where, but this is a general statement. So these constructed objects, i.e. hyperreal objects, are in a way more real than real objects, right? Kind of paraphrasing Tyrrell. So hence, real world action can ensue from them, from hyperreal, i.e. imaginary, you know, things. They still can lead to real action. Like again, a guy may be very religious and his behavior would change, right? In like a significant way. And it might not be just one guy, it might be 1 billion of people, for example, right? Or 7.5 billion of people, even. Yeah. So yeah, this is a general statement that constructed objects, i.e. hyperreal objects, are more real than real. And this is how propaganda works, right? Again, just as we saw with Christianity and perhaps other religions, that hyperreality might lead to real changes, you know. So it's still not completely disconnected from reality, that's what I'm saying. This is actually dangerous for reality itself, not only, like, I've said that hyperreality is vulnerable to real-world changes, right? When the supporting networks are disrupted, hyperreality vanishes. But hyperreality itself may impact reality, again, through things like propaganda and like ideas in general. Like if you have a sect which says, drink my Kool-Aid, and you drink your Kool-Aid, well, you know what happens, right? Or it may say something else to you, which I wouldn't say just for the sake of like safety on YouTube. Okay. Yeah, probably that's all I wanted to say about this. But still, one other important thing which is worth mentioning is that the key aspect of hyperreality is that something that nobody talks about, or even more so, like nobody hears being talked about, doesn't exist. And vice versa, what everyone talks about exists beyond doubt. So in a nutshell, this is like the ultimate degree of hyperreality, right? So think of modern media, easily recognizable, right? Something that nobody talks about doesn't exist, but what everyone talks about exists beyond doubt. This is more or less our current hyperreal picture of the world. And again, it's already obvious to everyone, or more or less everyone, right? Or at least the people I know. Well, maybe not all the people I know, but some people I know. Something like that. And probably the last thing I would talk about in this video is a certain fear of height, as I would call it. Again, it's slightly related to vulnerability of hyperreal objects. But what I mean here in particular is a certain vertigo you might get when you think about those things. Like well, what I mean by fear of height is, like, again, continuing this analogy of a hierarchy of supportive networks, even though it's kind of oxymoronic, but let's call it a pile of supportive networks, on top of which there's this hyperreal giga mega object, right? And it's a very huge pile. And it's very high up there, you know. And in this analogy, like falling from this height would be very painful, right? That's what I'm talking about. To speak in a more plain terms, like the more artificial our culture becomes, the more hyperreal it becomes, the more removed from reality, speaking in a very plain term, it becomes, the scarier the contrast with real reality becomes, right? Something like that. Like, well, I don't know, I can only give you like super trivial examples. Like, again, most of us are probably getting our food from the shelves of the supermarkets, right? But food doesn't appear on its own on the shelves of the supermarket. There needs to be a huge supportive network for it to appear there, right? And this is artificial, right? Already. In a way, it's hyperreal that you think that food appears in the supermarket on its own. If you do, of course you don't, but you actually behave as if you did, right? So in a practical way, you actually do believe that, right? Hence, like, again, disruption of these networks is, again, probably some people in the United States, as far as I've heard recently, are already experiencing something like that. Then the food can no longer appear in supermarkets, right? But the higher up you go, the more hyperreal you become, the bigger this problem becomes, right? So again, well, I don't know what example to give you, but then again, yeah, like, well, again, think about like some large solar storm that can kill the power grids, right? And suddenly we are back in the year 1900 or something, or even earlier, and we can only support like 1 billion of people with our level of technology, like pre-electricity level of technology. 6.5 billion people need to go somewhere, if you know what I mean. Yeah, and this is like, in a way, like the world of electricity is hyperreal as well, right? At least in the sense that it can be disrupted, as any network, as we've talked about before. All right, I think I need to like finish somewhere here. But anyway, like, you know, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. That's what I wanted to say, basically. And hyperreal objects, as a general rule, are very big, right? They require huge networks of support. Think about Tower of Babel, you know, this mythical example. This was a hyperreal object, right? Building a tower to the heaven, or socialism, like building a Tower of Babel in a single state, so to speak. So complexity cannot really increase indefinitely, and hence catastrophes, in a way, are inevitable, right? The more you increase complexity, the more there is a probability that one of the key nodes of the network would fail, and the whole network would fail, thus, right? And this hyperreal object would dissolve, and it would cause the catastrophe. However, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to die. Well, maybe 6.5 billion people are going to die in the case of electricity. Well, maybe less, because we have more knowledge, much more knowledge right now than we did previously. So maybe like, I don't want to give estimates of this sort. So what's the difference between a catastrophe and a crisis? So during a crisis, roughly speaking, one of the branches of the network dies out, right? Not necessarily a network. Usually people talk about systems, but okay, let's talk about systems in a more classical approximation, not yet network-oriented approximation. So in a system, we have a bunch of elements, and they are connected, right? That's a definition of the system. So in a crisis, one of the elements of the network system dies. In a catastrophe, it's the connections that die, all right? But the elements remain, and the elements may establish new connections. So this is the difference of catastrophe and a crisis. In a way, catastrophe is milder than a crisis. Well, that depends on a practical example, at least. But you know, in some aspects it's milder. But whatever, it's a separate discussion. So let's conclude this rant. Here we talked about the concept of hyperreality, or at least my interpretation thereof. I talked about 3 aspects thereof, namely Gnoseological aspect. We talked about the unfortunate situation where we're only dealing with the models of the world and not the world itself, but this is the only thing we can deal with. And these models are hyperreal, right? They are not real. They don't represent the real world. They can only like try to imitate it in a way. Then the second aspect was vulnerability of hyperreal objects, namely every hyperreal object requires a huge supportive network, and if key nodes of this network, at least one of them, fails, then hyperreal object dissolves, right? Disappears, basically. At least until the node would be fixed again. Then there's a moral aspect we mentioned, in particular, that there are different hyperreal objects to choose from, and the current reality is such that you can perhaps only choose few of them and ignore every other hyperreal object, right? And there is a moral choice of how much of these do you include in your life, something like that. Then we talked about how will to power relates to all of that, and I gave you examples of what is will to power. Well, like how is it, how it expresses itself in various phenomena, such as again masochism and various interesting other things. Then we talked about Christianity, how it built a perpendicular hierarchy of power, thus constructing an alternative hyperreality to Caesar's, roughly speaking, Caesar's hyperreality. Obviously, Caesar himself wasn't alive, or at least supposedly, during the establishment of Christianity. Again, according to the Jesuit version of history, all right? Whatever you take from that. Then I talked about how, in general, you can build such alternative hyper realities with alternative systems of values, and which explains how asceticism arises, right? So, and then we connected this to general propaganda aspect of hyperreality, when hyperreality itself starts impacting reality itself, even though it's not real in itself, so to speak. It only exists in your head, but your head can control some things in the world, right, through your body. Okay. And then I said that the key aspect of hyperreality, well, firstly, that the constructed objects are more real than real, right? And hence they can cause real-world action. And then I said that the key aspect of hyperreality is that that something that nobody talks about doesn't exist, and something that everyone talks about exists beyond doubt, right? And then I talked about how, again, vulnerable our society is because of ultimately vulnerability of hyperreal objects, right? Something like that. Yeah, that's pretty much all. So hopefully you've got some thoughts to ponder from this video. I apologize for it being a bit too chaotic and a bit too sketchy, like from a word sketch. Like it's just a bunch of strokes of paint, right? Not really representing anything, constructing anything hyperreal. Even though, as I've said, me in this video, and like the video itself, is hyperreal, definitely. Alright, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.